This week, we're just going to take a quick look at something that's a bit off the beaten track compared with other things we've been looking at in terms of programming and development. And what we're going to be doing is actually deploying our Web API service to Azure so that it's available not just locally when I'm developing and testing, but can be used in a real application. And I wanted to do this because we're going to need that when we're going forward with our Angular front end. It needs to talk to a back end, and I don't want to be having to run that up on my local machine every time. So it'd be useful to have that deployed. And although there is so much detail and different ways you can do things in Azure, which I'm not going to be looking at certainly this week, it's worth just showing you the basics of what I'm doing, because I don't want to have anything suddenly appearing that we haven't gone through. So let's just have a reminder of where we are with all this. And so remember, we've got our Web API RESTful web service, and if I just run that up, we see it launches the browser, and we've got this Swagger, which is a tool just for development really to see what's going on. And then I've also got the Angular front end, and if I run that up, then we can see that it's displaying the books that are being delivered by that Web API service that I just run up. So that's the setup we've got at the moment. But the issue I've mentioned a few times when we're looking at this is if we go to the Angular and if we take a look inside this repository service, we are hard-coded to using something on localhost that's running in development mode. Now, what I mentioned is we need to have that configurable in some kind of separate environment file. And I'm not going to do that this week, but I'm going to at least have an alternative that we can go to. Because the problem is, if I go back to the service and shut that down in Visual Studio, then now if we run this up again, we can see that although the front end runs up, it's now not getting any data. And in fact, if we just bring up the console, we can see that we're getting a failure when it tried to make that connection to 5001 Book Review because it's not there. So let's have something a bit more permanent that we can deal with that. And so what we're going to do is in Visual Studio, we're going to deploy this to Azure. Now, one thing that we've got to watch out for here is, remember, this API is using an SQLite database. So there we've got the actual database file, books.db. That's what contains all of those books. And for relatively small or medium scale websites or web services, actually SQLite is probably going to be powerful enough, and certainly in this case, to do what we want to do. You could move on to something like SQL Server or other databases as well, but we're going to stick with that. But because of the way that works, because of all the books and all the data we've got being actually in that books.db file, we've actually got to inform Visual Studio when it deploys this to Azure that that file has to go up there as well, along with the other bits and pieces. And in earlier versions of Visual Studio, there was actually a dialog box that can help with this, but that seems to have disappeared now. But it's easy enough. All we need to do is go to the project, and then somewhere in the project file directly, we put in an item group, which is just a way of grouping together data that you want to put in there. So there's our item group. And then in there, we put a content, and we say include. So this is telling it to include additional to the default files. We're going to include, and then I'm just going to say dot backslash and then star.db. So obviously we've specifically got that file called books.db. I could have put that in there, but I'm just going to be very general and just have any DB file. So if we add any other ones, that will work fine. And then the other thing I'm going to do, you've got a few options here, but the easiest one to do, we have this copy to output directory, and we set that one to preserve newest. So that just basically means that if we make any changes to the file, they'll be copied over as well. So that's told it to include that. And that's a useful tip if you've got any other files that go beyond the basic DLLs and so forth that are part of a normal project, then you can include them in there. So that will get that working. Then all we now need to do is actually do this deployment. So what we'll do is go to build and then publish book review API. And you can see immediately we get a huge number of different options for places we can publish it to, but we've made the decision we're going to go to Azure. So go directly to Azure and we'll make that choice. Now, we're doing something that's useful in small scale situations, publishing directly from Visual Studio. In a real commercial environment, you'd probably want some automated pipeline in something like Azure DevOps to do this. You wouldn't do it on a one-off basis. But as I say, lots of ways to do this. This is going to be just the very basics of what we can do. So we'll select Azure, and then we make the decision as to how we're going to deploy, whether you want your own virtual machine. So that would be a really high-end, high-usage website where you needed to configure the virtual machine very carefully. The normal ones that I'd be going for would either be the Windows or the Linux. And in fact, Linux is what in most cases I'd deploy to. The fact we can deploy to Linux is one of the key benefits we get with .NET Core, because .NET Core runs on both Linux and Windows, whereas older versions really only ran on Windows. And the reason that's a good thing is typically for the same performance machine, you will get it cheaper on Azure, not very much, but slightly, if you go with Linux. So that's what I'd normally deploy to. But there's a slight problem here. Once again, because we're using SQLite, that does not work on Linux. So we're going to go with the Windows one. Click Next again, and then we've got to do a few things. Now, first thing I've got to do is choose your subscription. You can see I've got a couple of subscriptions. I'm going to go with the Visual Studio Premium with MSDN. Basically what this is, I've got a Visual Studio, used to be called an MSDN subscription. That's how I pay for Visual Studio and that sort of thing. And it gives me a free or an included monthly allowance on Azure, so I get some things without having to pay for them directly. You might have that. You might want to get hold of a temporary Azure Pass just to play around with. You may have access to some other account, but that's the one I'm going with. Then we're going to have this idea of a resource group. Now, a resource group is simply a way in Azure of collecting together more than one thing that you want to have associated. So suppose, not in this case, but suppose we had the web API application, plus we had a SQL Server database, plus we maybe had some other things. We can just keep them all together in one resource group, and therefore if you want to move them around or delete them, it's much easier to manage. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to add a new resource group. So, well, actually, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give this deployed API service a name. So what it's done, it's just taken the name of the project and then added something based on the date on the end of that. Problem is, this actually has to be unique across the whole of Azure. So what it's going to produce as the URL for my site is bookreviewAPI.azurewebsites.net, and that's already been taken obviously by somebody else. So that's why it puts that big number on the end, but it's not much fun. So what I'm going to do is just give this a slightly long name, Coding Tutorials. So that's going to be the address it has. Now, of course, if you, again, got a commercial site, you can pay for your own domain and hook it up to this. But at the very minimum, it's going to have this as the name. Stick with my subscription there. Then I'm going to put in this new resource group. So I'm just going to call this Public Demo. So if I do any other of these, I'll put them all in the same resource group so I know where they are. Click OK on that. And then also I'm going to select a hosting plan. And this basically is configuring the pricing of where this is going to be served. So I can choose the location. I'm going to choose Western Europe for that. Basically, you can get some performance gains if you locate it nearest to where most of your users are. But actually, in terms of pricing, Western Europe, certainly for me, tends to be the cheapest one. And then you can actually configure the scale of what you've got. And I'm actually going to go for something absolutely simple here, which is go for the free one. So it's not even going to cost me anything. But you can see various options where we can scale up. It's not a permanent decision. Many of the time I'll start out with the free one when I'm developing. And then once we get users and we need a bit more power, we can scale up from there. So click OK on that, and that should all be OK. We'll click Create, and this will now actually create the app service in Azure. It'll take a little while because it's got to put all of that together. But once that's finished, we'll be able to see our new web service, even though we haven't actually deployed the application there yet. So it's just making a slot available for it. And you can see that it's done that. So if we just go to Next, I'm not going to worry about these deployment types. So we'll click Next, click Finish, and that will basically have that all set up, ready for us to click on the Publish. And we can see that if I just go into a browser, and if I go to the Azure portal, log in as myself, I've got various accounts on there. And then if we just look at resource groups, you can see it's got various ones that I have other things on in there. But Public Demos is there, the one we just created. And if we look inside there, it's actually because I've got my screen magnified, it's not showing it, so I'll just zip it out there. And you can see there it's got this actual API service, so that's the service, and it's also created that plan, which remember was my free one that I could scale up if I wanted to later on. So that's all of the things we've got in there. But we don't yet actually have that deployed. So let's now hit that button. So hit publish, and now it will build my application and does some checks, and then we'll push it out to that service. And so I'll do the usual speeding up of time here because it takes a little while. But you'll notice once it's finished that, it then launches that, and you can see there's the URL I mentioned, Coding Tutorials Book Review API.azurewebsites.net. But you can also see we've got the problem that it's not showing us anything. Now we shouldn't be too surprised about that because actually there's nothing directly under the root in our application. Remember, we've got a controller called Book Review. So if I were to just do /book review on there, then we can see we're getting back the JSON, which is the format for exactly what we want. So we can see that data is being served up. Remember, the other thing we did normally when we were running this locally, we would go for Swagger. But if we do that, we actually get that it's not found. We get a 404. And the reason for that is the default configuration of Swagger, if we look in Startup, you'll see down here, it only sets it off, along with some other things, if we're in development mode. So when we've deployed it, we're in production mode, and therefore that doesn't happen. Now, plenty of situations you may want the Swagger to be available even in your production version, in which case obviously you'd make a slight change to the code there, but in this case we don't want it, so we don't have it. But as we saw, we've still got that working perfectly well if we just go directly to the endpoint. And so now what we need to do is we need to simply change the Angular application so that it's going to use that new address. So let's take hold of that. Let's get hold of that URL and then go in here. And then just in the two places we're using that, we'll replace it with what I just copied from there. So both of those go in there. Once again, that's not really the right way to do it. We need to do it through a configuration file, but that's for the next video. That's what this is setting up. But now all I need to do is if I save that, remember Angular will refresh itself, and if we now go back in here, we are getting that data. But we're not getting that data locally anymore, we're getting that data from the web. It's exactly the same data that we can see there. Let's just prove that. Let's add a review. Let's make this one for Mansfield Park. Give that a review of 4 and add it. And we can see it takes a moment, but there we've got Mansfield Park down the bottom there. But more importantly, if we go back to this one, which we know is looking at Azure, no Mansfield Park at the bottom at the moment, but if I just do an F5 on that, there you can see we've got the new one in there. So it's not super powerful, but it is running publicly. Anyone can get at that. Maybe I should put some security on. We'll probably do that in a later video. And if a lot of people are using it, I'd want to scale it up. The free version is not going to be particularly good at throughput, but that's how easy it is to deploy something, a website or a web service or whatever it may be, to Azure and get it out there and available. So I hope you enjoyed that. The purpose of that, remember, was so that we can now have this configurable version of the front end that can either look at the local API or the deployed one. But I hope that was helpful. If you liked it, do click the like button, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.